Welcome to our posts. Today we will see stories of r/malicious compliance. Tenant asking landlord, me, to be more professional. I am a small-time landlord, with just 4 tenants. Earlier this year, I had 2 sisters that didn't respond to my requests to add of the gal's husband to the lease, though he was living with them. Not a big deal, but did I mention the pit bull they also brought home, without permission? I do allow pets, and had previously approved their other dog. I asked nicely in person and by email in the months leading up to the malicious compliance. They also did not respond when I asked if they were happy there, and wanted to renew their lease for the following year. I asked again. Then I emailed them notice that I would start showing the unit 2 days later. I try to be a nice landlord. I do. They had a newborn as well, so I scheduled all of the showings within a 2-hour window on the same night so I could be in their space as little as possible. Also, because they had not responded, and it was now serious crunch time for getting another tenant and my spouse worked all the following 2 weeks during evening showing hours, I had the delightful inconvenience of bringing my 2- and 6-year-old children with me to the showings. Because I'm not a corporation, I'm a small-time family landlord with kids. Try to imagine how difficult it is to conduct business meetings with 2 kids, right? Then imagine staggering showings every 15 minutes, with prospective tenants who are also bringing their own kids. Just to further clutter your imagination, this is an 800 square foot 2-bedroom apartment with a cozy entryway. So I arrive with my 2 kids, to find that my tenants are still at home, along with the husband, the newborn and the other sister's boyfriend. So that's 7 people in a small kitchen already. Then the first prospective tenants start arriving. Husbands, wives, with kids, and some showing up early, so there's 2 sets of them. That's 14 people in a small kitchen. And I'm a mom. I have magical powers. So I'm holding my toddler, my daughter is safely under the dining table coloring, and I'm chatting with the prospective tenants and directing traffic while my actual tenants prepare to depart. If you didn't know this already, it's common practice in the US to leave the premises during real estate or apartment showings. This was their first apartment, so I actually emailed them ahead of time to let them know what is generally expected at showings. Example: a relatively tidy apartment, and that they can leave for their own convenience. They do eventually leave after the boyfriend tells a prospective tenant that he, in fact, also lives there. And I carry on with an exhausting scheduling of showings. And have my new tenants all picked out and lease signed by the next day. Awesome, right? The next night, I get a voicemail from the husband, who is not my tenant. I saved it, and just listened to it again, because it still gives me that same delightful shiver of malicious compliance. In his voicemail, he told me how awful it was that my children touched his infant's things. They didn't, because I keep my kids entertained with magical mommy toys, but prospective tenants also brought children, and how they had to sterilize everything to keep their infant from being sick, and how inconvenient it was to have showings with only 2 days' notice, and how very unprofessional I was to bring my children, and asked if I could just be more professional in the future. You can hear it, can't you? The deep shiver of malicious compliance vibrating through my offended being. The next morning, I started issuing professional lease violation notices. One for the extra residents of the unit, hubby and boyfriend. One for the extra dog. And a few additional ones for building concerns I noted during the showings. They ignored the violation notice, which I sent by certified mail and, thoughtfully, also by email. I decided to be even more professional 30 days later, and issue a 5-day notice to vacate. And I called their mom, who is their emergency contact, as an eviction notice is an emergency. Did I mention that their lease was due to end just a few weeks later? But it would be unprofessional of me to let these violations slide until then. 3 days later, they'd magically sent me all the information I'd requested, removed the other dog, licensed the first dog, gotten the required pet insurance. They moved out on their lease termination date. And skipped out on their last electric bill, and left the unit in damaged condition. Despite my professional security deposit disposition statement and request for payment, they ignored those notices, until I stated I would proceed to small claims court by X date for the total due beyond their security deposit. On X date, they replied stating they didn't think it was fair that they should have to cover damages to the unit, or pay any more money toward their utility bill. Yep. 2 months later, There we were in the lobby of the courthouse, sitting across from each other on uncomfortable waiting room benches. They're laughing among themselves about how they're going to get their full security deposit back. And I'm quietly reviewing my presentation notes to the judge and my sizable stack of evidence, photographs, videos. This was my first time in court, but I wasn't laughing. I was preparing. 1 hour later, we're back in the lobby, and their mom is trying to write me a check for the full amount of the judgment. She doesn't have a pen. Her kids don't have a pen. I, however, have a pen. I cheerfully offer my pen. She writes the check and hands it to me, and, wait. I hold my hand again. Got my pen back too. I was so proud of myself for not saying any of the sassy things in my head in that moment. You know why? Because I was being professional, as I'd been from the moment he'd left that voicemail. As a last note, I do acknowledge that it would have been better if I hadn't brought my children. However, if you have kids, you'll understand that sometimes they simply have to go where you go. Next story. Neighbor tells Gramps he should mind his own damn business. That advice costs neighbor most of his yard and a car. Gramps had just moved into a retirement park with a lot that backed up to county land that was a nature preserve. His backyard was basically non-existent, but he didn't mind as he got to look out over the preserve. However, he did marvel at how his next-door neighbor's backyard extended a good 8 foot past his, giving neighbor a nice space back there. Gramps tried to be friendly with all his new neighbors, exchanging phone numbers and the like, and one day he noticed the next-door neighbor was putting down expensive pavers that extended from his back door all the way to the old fence posts that designated the preserve boundary. Gramps watched the neighbor yank the 3 rickety fence posts out of the ground and move them back an extra 2 feet into the preserve before pounding them back in, then started to clear the land, intending to gain himself more area for his pavers. Gramps used to work for the National Park Services as a young lad, so he thought he had better warn his neighbor of the consequences of his actions, so he heads out back for a little chat. Neighbor is immediately defensive, and before Gramps says much, neighbor tells him, "You're new here, I've been here 10 years, and to mind your own damn business." Gramps decides not to press the issue. Nothing happens that year, but the following year, when most of the park emptied out to head north for the summer, the county comes by to check on the preserve. Gramps notices them going back and forth behind his neighbor's house. The workers are pulling out maps and taking photos and making phone calls, and soon more guys show up. Turns out neighbor has moved the posts several times over the years, and in reality his backyard is supposed to be even smaller than Gramps' backyard. To make it worse, neighbor put pavers in the back specifically to park both his golf cart and a cherry red sports car back there for the summer, so the county will have to move them before they can do anything else. They tape a notice to the front door and leave. Gramps goes over to read it, and it states that neighbor was in violation of encroaching onto protected lands. He has 30 days to move his car, tear up the pavers, and pay a fine of $11,000 because of damage to endangered species who inhabit the protected lands, as well as trespassing fees. Failure to do so within 30 days will result in golf cart and car being towed and impounded. Pavers will be dug up and carted off at neighbor's expense, and the fine will increase for every additional day past the deadline. 30 days comes and goes, so a week after that Gramps has quite the show, as first the car and cart were towed, pavers were dug up and hauled off, and the old fence posts and ropes were replaced with metal posts embedded into buried cement bases, connected by steel cables. Whole process took several weeks to finish, but the preserve looked a lot more legit when they were done. A few solar cameras were installed so the county could monitor the wildlife and encroachers remotely. Meanwhile, more notices were taped to the front door of neighbor's house. By November, the snowbirds were flooding back into the park, including neighbor. That was Gramps' second show of the summer as neighbor reads all the notices, digging down until he reads the first one, then runs out back and starts screaming and cussing up a storm before running back to his car to dig out his cell phone so he can call the county to find out where his car and golf cart were. Gramps stays indoors to avoid the guy as he is frantically trying to unload his car, turn on his water and electricity, get the AC in the toilets going, and all the while trying to get someone at county to pick up the phone and give him some answers. He finally gets a live person and proceeds to scream at them while on speakerphone about his car and cart, so the call keeps getting kicked to other people because who wants to help a screamer? Basically, neighbor is told to come to the county office to get this straightened out. 3 days later, neighbor catches Gramps outside and asks if he was here when the county stole his car and destroyed his backyard. Gramps said he was, and neighbors says, well, why didn't you call me when you saw them putting notices on my door? You had my number up north. Gramps said he had thought about doing that, but figured neighbor would prefer him to mind his own damn business, so he decided against it. Next story. Is this the hottest wing you have? I used to own a wing joint. Nothing fancy, but a good selection of wing flavors and beer. Inevitably, we would have people come in and order the suicide wings. I like super spicy foods, so these were pretty damn hot. Of those people, about 5 to 10% would always start the joke and sarcastic conversation, these aren't that hot. Can't you do better? Yuck, yuck, yuck. One of my best regulars, a dentist who fancied himself a gardener, decided to help us out and planted a ghost pepper bush, at the time the hottest pepper in the world, and he could bring us the bounty of his harvest. And he would intentionally underwater the bush so the peppers would be as hot as they could be. When he would bring us the peppers, I would grind them, seeds and all, into a nice paste which I would combine with our suicide sauce and keep to the side for when our spicy wing connoisseurs would show up and complain about the suicide sauce not being hot enough. I would only serve them one death head wing, seemed a fitting name. I would make them wear gloves to eat it to prevent capsaicin burns on their skin. I would specifically tell them about the heat they were about to get into, trying to dissuade them from eating this culinary monstrosity. By the time we got through all this, every single person always now viewed this as an insult to their manhood, never had a woman complain about heat, but would sometimes actually ask if there was another level they could try, and could not be stopped from eating this wing. So they did. The fun thing about capsaicin oil is it can often take a few seconds to kick. Usually just enough time for the person to scarf down the wing and start to smugly tell us how it wasn't that hot. And then the heat would begin. And once it started, it was relentless. The wing was free, but the cup of milk after was $20. I never had a single person ask for a second one. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, make sure like, comment, share and subscribe the channel or posts.